Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the air smells like roasted beans, tobacco, and old stories. You're standing at the heart of 16th century Istanbul, under a flickering oil lamp, while the hum of strangers swells around you. Someone laughs too loudly, someone else quotes a line of poetry, and somewhere in the background, a kettle sighs like it's tired of boiling the same old water. You've just entered an Ottoman coffeehouse, a place where silence was practically outlawed. The floorboards creak beneath your sandals as you shuffle deeper in, blinking through the haze of pipe smoke and candle soot. The air is thick, heavy with that strange new drink everyone can't stop talking about, kava. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes here, not because it's dangerous, but because sleep is impossible when everyone's debating philosophy at full volume. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand near a low wooden table, the kind that forces everyone to hunch just a little closer together. A copper pot, sezva they call it, rests over hot sand, bubbling gently. The smell is dark and earthy with a whisper of cardamom. A server pours the steaming liquid into a tiny porcelain cup without handles. The first sip bites your tongue, bitter, almost medicinal, but the warmth spreads quickly through your chest. Around you, the coffeehouse murmurs with energy. A dervish in patched robes argues about divine love. Two merchants from the bazaar gossip about prices, while a poet reads verses he swears were dictated to him by an angel. You're beginning to realize this isn't just a place for drinking. It's a living organism, constantly buzzing, pulsing, talking. Historians still argue whether these coffeehouses were truly democratic spaces or just social theatres for men with too much time on their hands. But for now, they feel like the city's nervous system, every rumour, idea and dream flowing through the cups. In one corner, a storyteller clears his throat. The chatter softens slightly, like waves pulling back before a crash. He begins with the traditional opening, something about a prince, a djinn, and a promise made under a crescent moon. The crowd leans in. You do too. The story spills out, twisting and coiling like smoke, and even the kettle seems to listen. Ottoman coffeehouses weren't fancy. Rough wooden walls, benches without cushions, and shelves filled with mismatched cups. Yet there's a quiet elegance to the disorder, like the place doesn't need decoration because it's already rich in conversation. The light flickers over faces both weary and wide-eyed. A few soldiers rest their swords against the wall, their armor clinking softly as they shift. You catch a bit of chatter about the latest decree from the Sultan. Apparently, taxes are going up again. Someone mutters that even Allah wouldn't approve of the bureaucracy in this city. Laughter ripples through the room. In a world where the wrong words could earn you a visit from the palace guards, humor becomes rebellion in disguise. One scholar scribbles notes on a scrap of parchment, his fingers stained with ink. He's recording what's being said, not for fame, but for the sheer pleasure of documenting human noise. It's easy to forget, but this humble coffeehouse is an engine of memory. Ideas born here will eventually travel far beyond these walls, into literature, politics, even revolutions. And yet, if you close your eyes for a moment, all you really hear is life itself. The spoon tapping the rim of a cup, the shuffle of slippers, the low hum of men thinking out loud. It's chaotic, yes, but somehow deeply soothing. You take another sip. The bitterness has mellowed now, replaced by something smoother, almost sweet. Someone jokes that the coffee is so strong it could wake the dead. Another replies, that's exactly the point. Why sleep when there's so much to argue about? There's a strange intimacy here. Strangers sit shoulder to shoulder, debating everything from theology to the proper way to groom a beard. You realize that this room, smoky and loud as it is, might be one of the few places in the empire where class, wealth, and status blur. A fisherman can challenge a scholar, and no one blinks, unless the scholar loses. As you listen, time feels soft, elastic. The city outside fades away, the clatter of hooves, the call to prayer, the markets closing for the night. Inside, only conversation matters. The air smells faintly of molasses tobacco and scorched copper. Somewhere, a cat purrs beneath a bench, and you, the newcomer, are beginning to understand that silence here isn't golden, it's suspicious. Coffeehouses are temples of talk, sanctuaries for restless minds. Every sentence, every laugh, every clink of a cup contributes to an invisible orchestra that plays deep into the night. Before long, your heartbeat synchronizes with the rhythm of it all, the hiss of boiling water, the murmur of debate, the sigh of the wind through a cracked window. The empire outside may be ruled by sultans, but inside this little wooden box, speech reigns supreme. You lean back, feeling the wood press gently against your spine, and let the warmth of the cup seep into your palms. You don't realize it yet, but you've entered a world where a simple drink reshaped society, where caffeine became conversation, and conversation became power. You're still seated in that same smoky room, but the air feels different now, charged with something ancient and new at once. The aroma of coffee clings to your clothes, to your hair, to the wooden beams above your head. You start to wonder, how did this tiny bean end up here, in the center of the Ottoman world, stirring so much trouble and conversation? It all begins far to the south, in Yemen's rugged highlands. Imagine narrow terraces carved into mountain slopes, fields of dark green shrubs crowned with red cherries glistening like blood under the sun. These are coffee plants, humble, unassuming, and utterly addictive. Local Sufi mystics first used the drink to stay awake during their all-night devotional chants. They called it kahwa, meaning that which prevents sleep. And no, you definitely wouldn't last one of their vigils. Even the coffee might give up before you did. From these sleepy mountain villages, the beans traveled north along the Red Sea trade routes. Merchants carried sacks of them on camel caravans, alongside frankincense and spices. Eventually, the beans reached the great port of Mocha, the name that would later make every modern coffee chain sound slightly exotic. Ottoman sailors and traders tasted the brew there, and something in their bones told them it was special. By the mid-1500s, the drink had reached Mecca, Cairo, and finally Istanbul, the beating heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Historians still argue whether coffee first arrived in Istanbul as a medicinal curiosity or a smuggler's secret. Some say the first cups were served in the private chambers of physicians who prescribed it for melancholia of the soul. Others believe it came hidden among spice shipments, smuggled in to please the sleepless elite. However it got there, one thing's certain: it didn't stay secret for long. You can picture it, a few enterprising men setting up stalls near the Grand Bazaar, roasting beans over charcoal and pouring out steaming cups to curious passers-by. The city was already addicted to conversation, and now it had fuel for it. Soon, coffeehouses, kahvehain, began popping up everywhere. By the 1550s, there were dozens across Istanbul, each one brimming with gossip, laughter, and that unmistakable burnt sugar scent. The empire took to it like a poet to metaphors. The drink was strong, black, and socially contagious, but there was something subversive about it too. Unlike wine or liqueur, coffee didn't cloud the mind. It sharpened it. People stayed awake longer, talked more, questioned more, and in a world ruled by absolute authority, that was dangerous. You shift in your seat as an old man across the table explains how the first coffee beans were roasted. Always over hot sand, he insists, wagging a finger. The fire burns too unevenly. He tells you that early baristas, if you can call them that, were more like chemists than cooks. They measured temperature with their hands, timing with instinct. One sneeze, and you'd scorch a week's worth of beans. He leans closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They say coffee was first roasted by accident, he says. A goat herder left his beans near the fire, and when he tasted them later, the bitterness woke his soul. You smile. It's one of those stories that sounds too perfect to be true. But then again, so is most of history. Outside, the night deepens, and a light drizzle taps the window. Inside, though, no one moves to leave. Coffeehouses never really sleep. They are like the empire itself, restless, always thinking, always talking. The same patterns repeat across cities. A few low tables, benches along the walls, and a brazier glowing softly in the corner. Someone nearby mentions that the beans are taxed now. Apparently, the Sultan realized that taxing conversation is even more profitable than taxing trade. A few grumbles ripple through the room, but no one seems surprised. After all, even rebellion needs a permit here. A young poet joins your table, clutching a small notebook. He tells you he's been writing about the alchemy of coffee, how it transforms fatigue into thought. He reads a few lines aloud, something about liquid night poured into the vessel of the mind. It's overwrought, but charming. Everyone claps politely, and someone jokes that the coffee itself wrote it. Historians still debate whether the rise of coffee culture helped shape the Ottoman Enlightenment or merely distracted the scholars who could have created one. But it's impossible to deny the energy these places generated. Ideas once whispered in palaces now floated openly across smoky rooms like this. You sip again, and the bitterness feels familiar now, almost comforting. It's the taste of connection, of stories shared by people who might never agree but still want to talk. And as your cup empties, you realize that this drink didn't just fuel conversation, it fueled civilization. By the time dawn's first light begins to touch the domes of the city, the brazier's embers have dimmed, but the room is still full of murmurs. Someone is already preparing a fresh pot. The city outside may be stretching awake, but the coffeehouse never really slept. It simply shifted from night talk to morning philosophy. You think back to those Yemeni hillsides where it all began, and how impossible it must have seemed that a little cherry seed could change the rhythms of an empire. But it did. It replaced wine in social life. It made people talk louder and think deeper, and it turned sleeplessness into a form of community. You lean back against the wooden wall, eyes half closed, still listening to the hum of voices. Somewhere between the steam and the silence, history began to percolate. The next evening arrives like thick velvet, and once again, you find yourself in that familiar haze of smoke and chatter. Tonight, though, the mood feels different, tenser, more electric. The talk isn't about poetry or prices anymore. It's about something deeper, something sacred. A man at the next table gestures wildly with his cup, nearly spilling his coffee as he declares that the drink itself is sinful. Across from him, another man laughs so hard he nearly chokes. You've stumbled into one of the great Ottoman controversies, the theological war over coffee. It's easy to forget now. When coffee is a harmless morning habit, but in the 1500s, this drink was dangerous precisely because it did something miraculous. It made people think. The early imams and scholars weren't sure what to do with that. Some said coffee intoxicated the spirit just like wine did, and thus it was haram, forbidden. Others argued the opposite, that it merely sharpened the senses and allowed one to stay awake in prayer. Historians still argue whether the first bans on coffee were genuine moral concerns or just clever political moves to control the growing chatter in coffeehouses. Probably both. You can picture the clerics' frustration. One moment they were preaching to sleepy congregations, and the next, half the city was awake all night, debating theology over cups of roasted rebellion. The first real scandal began in Mecca around 1511. When the city's governor declared coffeehouses dens of seditious gatherings. The story goes that religious jurists were called in to debate the issue. Some warned that coffee inflamed the mind, while others pointed out that even dates could do the same thing if you ate too many. Eventually, coffee was banned temporarily, and naturally, people kept drinking it in secret. Nothing makes a beverage taste better than a little heresy. Fast forward a few decades, and the same controversy reaches Istanbul. The city is alive with gossip, rumors of fatwas, secret police, and public raids. You glance around the coffeehouse you're sitting in now, and for a brief moment, you can imagine what it must have been like when the Sultan's men burst through these same doors, shouting orders, confiscating kettles, and dumping pots of boiling kahve into the street. Steam and chaos everywhere. Someone probably laughed through it. You'd think that would have scared people off, but the bans had the opposite effect. When you tell a city full of insomniacs that they can't have coffee, you're basically guaranteeing they'll start brewing it underground, literally. Some coffeehouses hid in basements or back rooms, their entrances disguised as tailor shops or bakeries. If you asked for a loaf of bread and winked just right, you might be handed a steaming cup instead. You take a sip from your own cup now, half expecting a guard to burst in. The bitterness is oddly satisfying, like tasting defiance itself. Around you, the laughter continues, quiet but knowing. The irony is that coffeehouses had started as places for piety. The first ones in Istanbul were near mosques, built to give worshippers a place to gather between prayers. But human nature being what it is, things quickly got louder. The prayers turned into debates, the debates into jokes, and the jokes into small revolutions of thought. Before long, the imams were complaining that people were skipping sermons in favor of caffeine-fueled philosophy. One old man sitting beside you, his beard as white as milk foam, leans over and says, "They tried to ban laughter once too. Didn't work either. He grins, revealing a gold tooth. You laugh softly, and he winks before returning to his cup. There's a legend floating through the room tonight, one of those fringe tidbits you can't quite verify, but desperately hope is true. Supposedly, during one of the bans, a rebellious coffee vendor disguised himself as a funeral mourner, carrying a coffin filled with roasted beans. He'd stop in dark alleys, lift the lid, and pour cups for his fellow mourners. The dead, he claimed, was the spirit of conversation, and he was only keeping the wake alive. You can't help but admire that. People risk punishment not just for a drink, but for the right to talk, to share ideas, to laugh in public. Coffee had become a symbol of something much larger than itself: curiosity. The tension between religion and reason never fully disappeared, of course. Even centuries later, Ottoman scholars still wrote treatises debating whether caffeine was a blessing or a temptation. But here, in this little room, it's clear that the people have already made up their minds. Every cup poured is a tiny act of philosophy, a silent declaration that life is meant to be experienced awake. Outside, rain drizzles over the cobblestones. You can hear the faint call to prayer echoing from a nearby minaret, its notes trembling through the night air. Inside, the conversation continues uninterrupted. A lute player strums softly in the corner, the notes rising like smoke. Someone cracks a joke about how even the angels must be arguing over whether coffee's allowed in paradise. You smile, because that's the beauty of it, the mix of reverence and rebellion. Coffeehouses became mirrors of Ottoman society, deeply spiritual, endlessly curious, and occasionally ridiculous. Your cup is empty now, but your mind is buzzing. You realize that this simple beverage, roasted, ground, and boiled, was never really about caffeine. It was about consciousness, about being awake in every sense of the word, and as the fire in the brazier crackles low, you feel the truth of it. The empire's greatest ideas weren't born in palaces. They were whispered right here, between sips. The room feels warmer tonight, not because of the brazier, but because the conversations have taken on a new edge. You can sense it in the laughter that lingers a little too long, in the sideways glances shared between men who think too freely for their own good. You're sitting in a coffee house somewhere near the Grand Bazaar around 1570, and the empire is wide awake. The scent of roasting beans mingles with the smell of tanned leather, old parchment, and ambition. You listen as a group of young poets huddle around a table beside you. They're trading verses under their breath, their words flowing with the rhythm of rebellion. One of them leans in and says something about how the Sultan is more asleep than the moon. The others choke on their laughter, trying to hide it behind their cups. You can feel it, that dangerous thrill of saying the wrong thing in the right company. A storyteller in the corner begins to speak. His voice is low, almost hypnotic. Once there was a sultan, he says, who dreamed that every citizen whispered his name in fear. So he ordered silence. The crowd leans closer, grinning. But the people learn to whisper louder. Laughter ripples through the room, slow and dangerous. You realize that everyone understands the message. This story isn't about some mythical ruler. It's about the man in the palace right now. The air crackles with mischief. This isn't rebellion with swords and banners. It's rebellion brewed slowly, one cup at a time. You sip your coffee and feel its warmth spread through your veins like courage. One merchant tells a tale of a janissary who got drunk on coffee instead of wine, arguing all night about the meaning of justice. Another man swears he saw a group of dervishes in Galata chanting praises to Allah while passing around a chesve instead of a prayer bead string. It's sacred, one of them supposedly said. It keeps the heart awake. That line sticks with you, it keeps the heart awake. Maybe that's what all this noise is really about. Coffee doesn't make people riot. It makes them remember that they're alive. In another corner, a painter sketches scenes of the coffee house. The gleam of brass pots, the curls of steam, the shadows of faces half lit by candlelight. His charcoal strokes move quickly, nervously, as if he's trying to capture a ghost before it fades. You peek over his shoulder and notice a curious detail. Every figure has their mouth open, mid-speech. No one here drinks in silence. The fringe tidbits tonight are almost unbelievable. Someone swears that in Damascus, coffeehouses are being used to organize chess tournaments with secret political meanings, each move representing a change in power. A bishop in Aleppo reportedly called coffee the devil's milk. And in Cairo, rumor has it that the baristas sprinkle salt on the coals to keep the conversation from dying out. You can't tell which parts are true, but that's half the fun. Truth, like coffee, gets better when brewed slowly. You shift in your seat and glance toward the door. A couple of men in fine silk robes walk in, trying too hard to look casual. Government informants, maybe. You can always tell. They don't laugh enough. The regulars ignore them, but the tone of conversation drops to a safer register. For a few minutes, people talk about the weather, trade, and the latest poetry collection blessed by the palace censors. But then, as quietly as they came, the informants leave. And just like that, the laughter returns. Louder this time. Someone mutters, "Even the spies need their coffee." The room erupts, but you can feel the shift happening in real time. These coffeehouses are turning into laboratories of free speech, places where people test the limits of what they can say without being dragged off by the authorities. A young man stands up suddenly and slams his empty cup on the table. "They can ban us, but they can't make us sleep," he declares. The crowd cheers. It's absurd, maybe even a little theatrical, but the energy is contagious. Someone begins tapping a rhythm on the table with a spoon, and soon the whole room joins in. A spontaneous drumbeat of defiance. You look around and realize that the empire's pulse is here, not in the palace, not in the mosques, but in these noisy, cramped rooms filled with the smell of burnt sugar and talk. Every new idea passes through here first, wrapped in laughter and caffeine. There's a man with tired eyes sitting near the brazier. He's quiet at first, then he mutters something that silences the table. Rebellion doesn't always need blood. Sometimes it just needs breath. Everyone nods slowly. The brazier pops, sending a spark into the air. The night drifts on, heavy with thought and smoke. Outside, the Bosporus glimmers under a waning moon, the ships swaying gently as if eavesdropping on the city's dreams. Inside, you sip the dregs of your coffee, thick, grainy, almost chewy, and realize that every drop of it tastes like possibility. This, you think, is how revolutions begin. Not with swords or banners, but with sleepless men daring to talk too loudly over a cup of bitter courage. Tonight, the coffeehouse feels crowded. So crowded that you have to squeeze between elbows and turbans just to find a seat. The air is thick with noise and warmth. Every table glows with candles balanced in brass holders, and the ceiling hums with the weight of 100 simultaneous conversations. You're here for one reason. The city has been buzzing with rumors that the Sultan himself has had enough of all this noise. You slide onto a bench beside a merchant polishing a copper cup. They say the Sultan's ordered a ban again, he whispers without looking up. You raise an eyebrow, and he shrugs. Third time this decade. He can't help himself. The city won't shut up. This is the famous clash. Sultan versus the cup. By now, coffeehouses aren't just popular. They're everywhere. Every neighborhood, every port, every dusty alley has one. You could walk from Topkapi Palace to the Golden Horn and never go more than a few minutes without catching the scent of roasted beans. And that was exactly the problem. The rulers were worried. Not about the drink, but the talk. Too much thinking happening outside palace walls. Too many jokes about taxes, wars, and worst of all, about the Sultan's policies. The state wanted silence, but coffee made people louder, braver, sharper. Historians still argue whether Sultan Murad IV's infamous coffee ban was truly about public order, or just an attempt to show control. But one thing's certain, he took it personally. This was a man who patrolled the streets in disguise at night, hunting for smokers and coffee drinkers. Some say he carried a sword and an executioner's mood. You imagine him striding through the alleys of Istanbul, cloak drawn, nostrils flaring at the faintest whiff of coffee smoke. Somewhere nearby, a barista freezes mid-pour, heart pounding. A pot tips, hissing into the coals. The Sultan opens the door, and everyone pretends they were just talking about God. One rumor claims he executed a man for drinking coffee twice. Another insists he only broke pots to make a point. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the fear was real enough. Coffee houses went underground again, and the city entered what some historians half-jokingly call the dark roast years. You sip from your own cup now, the flavor strong and defiant. A storyteller nearby begins a parable about a king who feared the voices of his own people. The crowd chuckles softly, careful not to laugh too loudly. It's a dangerous joke, but that's half the thrill. Then, just as you're sinking into the rhythm of it, a sudden commotion at the door. 2 guards push through the crowd, scanning faces. Everyone goes still. You can hear the hiss of the coals, the slow dripping of water from a pot lid. One of the guards sniffs the air. "Coffee?" he says. The room holds its breath. The owner, an old man with shaking hands, smiles weakly. "Just hot water for tea, sir. Nothing more." He holds up an empty pot as proof. The guard narrows his eyes, inhales once more, then grunts. "Smells like rebellion," he mutters, and leaves. The door closes, and the silence breaks instantly into laughter. Someone raises his cup. "To the Sultan," he toasts. "May his nose always lead him away from us." The room roars. For a brief, golden moment, fear turns into camaraderie. You realize that every ban only makes these people stronger. Each crackdown forges tighter bonds. The coffee house isn't dying, it's evolving. They adapt, using secret knocks, hidden basements, even coded recipes. Instead of coffee, they ask for ink water. Instead of sugar, they say poetry dust. The guards never quite catch on. There's a quirky legend from this time, a fringe tidbit that always resurfaces in Ottoman folklore. Supposedly, one coffee house disguised itself as a barber shop. The barbers brewed coffee in the back room and used the mirrors to keep watch for guards. Whenever danger approached, they'd lather customers' faces in foam and start humming loudly to cover the smell. Somewhere between grooming and rebellion, the empire learned the art of multitasking. Meanwhile, even the scholars couldn't agree. Some condemned the bans as tyranny, others insisted the Sultan was saving the empire from chaos. But as one anonymous pamphlet of the era put it, "A people silenced is a people asleep." You glance around the room and realize that's what truly terrifies the rulers. Not the coffee, but the waking. Coffee houses kept people alert in every sense of the word. They turned weary subjects into thinkers, questioners, storytellers. And once people start questioning, no amount of censorship can put the lid back on the pot. You catch a young man at the next table, drawing caricatures on a scrap of paper, a crooked-nosed figure labelled His Majesty of Sleep. Everyone around him snickers. The drawing vanishes into a sleeve before the laughter fades. You realize these rooms are producing something even more powerful than debate, satire. The empire's first comedians, poets, and political cartoonists all trace their roots back to places like this. As the night wears on, a musician in the corner strums a slow tune on an oud. The melody weaves through the smoke like a sigh. Outside you can hear the faint echo of soldiers' boots passing by, but no one inside flinches anymore. The fear has dulled into defiance, the defiance into routine. By the time dawn arrives, you understand the absurd beauty of it all. The Sultan rules by day, but by night, the city belongs to the drinkers. You raise your empty cup in silent salute. Somewhere beyond the walls, a rooster crows. The guards may patrol the streets, but here, in the steam and laughter, freedom still brews quietly. Morning returns to Istanbul with a kind of golden exhaustion. You step out of the coffee house just as the first light hits the domes of the mosques, glinting off minarets like blades of sunlight. The streets are quieter now. Vendors set up their stalls, sweeping away the ashes from last night's brazier fires. The air smells faintly of the sea, bread, and something else, something richer, darker. Someone is brewing early again. You follow the scent to a narrow alley where a woman in a headscarf crouches over a small pot. She's heating coffee over coals so low they barely glow. When you greet her, she smiles, showing a row of teeth stained slightly brown from years of tasting her own product. "You want the strong kind?" she asks softly. You nod. She pours it thick, almost like tar, into a small chipped porcelain cup. No sugar, no foam, just liquid fire. "Careful," she says. "That's the sort that makes men talk too much." You drink, and it's true. Within seconds, your mind begins racing again. The warmth isn't just in your throat. It climbs behind your eyes, unlocking ideas you didn't know you'd stored there. That's what this drink always did. It connected people, conversations, and thoughts like invisible threads running through the empire. As you walk through the waking city, you notice the quiet signs of coffee's underground life. A tailor's shop with an extra kettle in the back. A bookseller whose ink-stained hands always smell faintly of roasted beans. Even the calligraphers near the mosque have small metal flasks they sip between strokes of their pens. Coffee has become code, part of Istanbul's nervous system. And yet, despite the Sultan's fury, something unexpected happens. His ban creates a strange paradox. The fewer people who are allowed to drink coffee, the more valuable it becomes. By outlawing it, he turns it into treasure. Coffee isn't just a drink anymore. It's resistance in liquid form. Smugglers begin to thrive. They cross the Bosphorus at night, hiding sacks of beans beneath piles of wool and fruit. Some even hollow out loaves of bread to conceal roasted grounds. Women become the most skillful couriers. They hide coffee beans in baskets of herbs, claiming they're for medicinal use. When guards search them, they laugh and say, "Search all you want, gentlemen. This cure is for headaches, not heresy." You picture a night by the harbour. 2 fishermen exchanging a small, sealed jar. One nods solemnly and the other whispers, "For the faithful of the bean." They laugh quietly before vanishing into the mist. It's during this period that Istanbul's coffee code develops, a secret language of trade and taste. Black cloth means dark roast, light silk means weak brew, 2 cups before dawn means the guards are asleep. Coffee houses use it to coordinate deliveries and warn one another of raids. If you saw a broom hanging outside a door at night, it didn't mean cleaning. It meant, "We're open," quietly. Over time, this network grows so vast that even the authorities begin to give up. Too many people, too many cups, too many secrets. The city hums beneath its own ban like a hive pretending to be asleep. And in this hush of resistance, art begins to bloom. Painters start sketching portraits of men holding small cups, symbolic, subtle. Poets write verses where dark water stands for forbidden thoughts. Musicians compose songs with rhythms mimicking the bubbling sound of sesves on the fire. By the mid-1600s, foreign merchants from Venice, Marseille, and London begin to take notice. They bring stories home about this strange Ottoman drink that fuels conversation and defiance in equal measure. European travelers describe Istanbul's coffee houses with fascination, places of eloquent uproar, where men argue about poetry and prophecy while sipping black liquids stronger than wine. Soon, coffee starts to sail beyond the empire's borders. What began as a secret ritual in the alleys of Mecca and the streets of Istanbul becomes a global phenomenon. The Venetians bring it to Italy, calling it café. The French romanticize it. The English gentry debate its morality. And within decades, London will have its own version of these same smoky, restless rooms. But here, in the heart of the Ottoman capital, the energy still feels sacred. Like the city itself knows that something enormous is brewing. You sense it in the laughter, in the way men and women speak faster, think sharper, love deeper. Coffee is no longer just a drink. It's the bloodstream of civilization itself. As the woman who sold you your cup packs up her things, you ask her if she ever worries about being caught. She shrugs. "They can take my pot," she says, "but they can't unboil my thoughts." You walk away smiling, realizing that every empire that tries to ban ideas only ends up feeding them. The aroma of roasted beans follows you all the way down to the water's edge, where fishermen cast nets into the glittering dawn. The tide smells faintly of salt and smoke and freedom. And somewhere, deep in the old palace, the Sultan turns restlessly in his sleep, unaware that his people are already awake. By the time the Sultan's spies have stopped counting cups, the coffee house has already become something else entirely. It's no longer just a place to drink. It's a place where the empire dreams out loud. You push open a warped wooden door, and instead of silence, you're hit with a warm hum, a soft chaos that feels alive. Smoke curls upward in lazy spirals, and through it, the sound of pens scratching, dice clattering, and men whispering ideas that sound almost too bold to exist in daylight. You take a seat near the window, where the glass is so warped, it bends the lantern light into gold rivers. Someone pushes a cup toward you. It's thick, sweetened with honey this time. The man grins. "New recipe. I call it the thinker's brew." He's not joking. The moment it hits your tongue, you can taste cinnamon and danger. This is where the empire's ink begins to flow, literally. In these rooms, letters are written, proclamations drafted, verses shared, and news copied by hand faster than the official scribes can control. Historians will later call it the embryo of journalism, but here and now, it's just talk. You can hear a barber reading aloud a report from Damascus. Someone interrupts to argue whether the Sultan's latest tax will ruin trade. Another man, a poet with more beard than sense, interrupts with a metaphor about tulips and tyranny. Every sentence feels like it might change something. And that's what makes these coffee houses so revolutionary. They democratize words. You don't need a title to speak here. You only need a cup and a thought worth sharing. That thought scares the establishment more than any sword ever could. For centuries, information had flowed downward, from sultans to viziers, from viziers to imams, from imams to the people. But now for the first time, it's swirling sideways. cup to cup, mouth to ear, a kind of horizontal power. You glance at the table beside you, where a man is furiously writing. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear but excitement. He's copying a poem by Nefi, the Ottoman satirist whose verses are so sharp they could cut through silk. The man mutters, "I'll take this to Galata tomorrow. They'll read it all night." That's how it spreads. Not through printing presses, not through proclamations, but through the oldest network there is. People talking. A human web powered by caffeine. And from this quiet web, something strange begins to bloom. Ideas. Some of them are harmless. Philosophical debates about destiny, astronomy, or whether angels prefer coffee or tea. But others? They're dynamite. People start to question the divine right of rulers. They wonder aloud why the wealthy live like sultans while the poor sleep in the streets. Someone whispers about the new sciences coming from Europe, Galileo, Copernicus, telescopes peering at forbidden skies. Historians still argue whether this really was the start of Ottoman intellectual awakening, or just romantic nostalgia painted by later writers. But sitting here, in the thick smell of smoke and roasted beans, you feel it. This is the hum of thought awakening after centuries of silence. Across the room, a group of students debate theology so loudly that even the musicians pause to listen. If God gave man reason, one says, then using it cannot be sin. His friend replies, unless reason makes you question the wrong people. Laughter erupts, nervous but genuine. In the corner, a man begins to recite verses from memory. You don't recognize the language. It's Persian maybe, but you catch the rhythm, the sadness. When he finishes, the room applauds softly. Someone offers him another cup. The performance, the discussion, the laughter, they all blur together into a single pulse. It's in these same rooms that early pamphlets begin to form, the Mekmu'a, handwritten journals passed hand to hand. Inside are copied poems, debates, strange rumors. They're anonymous because everyone knows anonymity is safety. One wrong phrase, one critical joke about the palace, and you could disappear faster than a puff of coffee steam. Still, they write, and talk, and share. There's a saying whispered around these parts. If a man has no voice, give him a cup. It sounds like a proverb, but it's really a rebellion disguised as hospitality. One evening, a young man sits beside you, pulling a folded page from his robe. He shows you a diagram, crude, smudged, but unmistakable. It's a map of trade routes. He explains how coffee travels from Mocha to Cairo, to Istanbul, to Venice, and then to the rest of the world. Ideas, he says, tapping the parchment, move the same way. He smiles. Except ideas can't be taxed. You sip and nod, realizing that in these dimly lit corners, the Ottoman Empire is inventing something that will soon define modern civilization, the public sphere. But not everyone in the room understands that yet. Some just come to escape their wives, or the heat, or the boredom of routine. Others come for the gossip, who's marrying whom, who's been arrested, who's secretly trading sugar for profit. And some come for the simplest reason of all, the pleasure of sitting still while the world whirls around them. The irony is that this chaos of voices, this symphony of chatter, is what keeps the city stable. When people can talk, they don't have to shout. The coffee houses become pressure valves for a massive, complex empire, a place where thoughts can simmer instead of explode. As night deepens, you notice the last of the ink-stained men packing their scrolls. Someone sweeps the floors, another refills the coals. The light flickers over the murals on the wall, tiny paintings of ships and gardens, and one curious design, a small eye surrounded by swirling smoke. The man sweeping notices your gaze. That, he says, that's not an eye, it's a reminder. Even when we speak freely, someone's always listening, he winks. You can't tell if it's a joke. Outside, the streets are empty again. You can still hear faint murmurs behind closed shutters, the sound of a city thinking. Somewhere in another district, a poet sharpens his quill. A sailor hums a tune he heard in a coffeehouse weeks ago, and an idea, small and invisible, begins its slow, unstoppable journey across the empire. You wake to the sound of laughter, a deep, rolling laughter that spills through the narrow alleys like smoke. The sun's barely up, but the coffeehouses are already alive again. The bans are half forgotten, the punishments mostly ignored. Istanbul hums with caffeine and conversation. You follow the sound to a familiar doorway where, instead of prayer rugs and sermons, you find dice, chessboards, and swirling nargile smoke. Inside, it feels like organized chaos. Men huddle over backgammon boards, their brows furrowed in exaggerated drama, each move treated like a diplomatic treaty. The clatter of the dice feels rhythmic, almost musical. You sit down to watch, and instantly someone slides a cup toward you. No words needed. That's how it works here. Cups are introductions. You take a sip, and the man beside you mutters without looking up. Careful! This one makes you think you're smarter than you are. He moves his piece and grins when his opponent groans. Games have always filled these rooms, but not because people are bored. They're rehearsal for life. Every roll, every counter, every bluff becomes a metaphor for the empire itself. Luck and strategy, cunning and patience, power balanced on the edge of chance. Historians still argue whether these games were distractions from politics or politics disguised as play. Either way, no one here is silent. You drift to another corner where the air grows thick with nargile smoke. Sweet apple, burning amber, faint rose. The pipes hiss softly like whispering serpents. Groups of men lean in close, passing the hose between sentences. Some talk about trade ships from Alexandria, others about a rumored poet exiled to Damascus for a verse that rhymed too sharply with sultan. One man, his mustache curled like a question mark, murmurs, "Every empire needs its smoke. Ours just happens to taste better." There's a strange intimacy here. The coffee house is public, yet it feels like a family room. Everyone watches everyone else, but not unkindly. It's a living, breathing forum. One man tells a story about a merchant who outwitted pirates with fake cargo labels. Figs, he'd written, but the barrels were full of coffee beans. Another man interrupts to ask if the merchant survived. Of course, the storyteller replies. He ended up richer than the pirates. Moral of the story, caffeine is stronger than cannonballs. The room erupts with sleepy laughter. And then come the gossipers, the true chroniclers of Ottoman life. They perch near the door, always pretending to be on their way out but never leaving. They whisper about the Grand Vizier's rumoured mistress, about the price of figs, about a muezzin in Üsküdar who fell asleep mid-call to prayer because he'd had too much coffee. You can't tell where truth ends and invention begins, but that's the beauty of it. Here, imagination is currency. In one dimly lit corner, a group of older men plays mangala, a game of small stones and hollowed wooden boards. It's hypnotic, the clicking of pebbles sounding like slow rainfall. They barely speak. The game itself is their dialogue. You watch for a while, realizing this is how ideas travel too. Not in grand speeches, but in small, deliberate moves, one thought placed carefully beside another. On the far side of the room, a storyteller sets up his stage, a low table, a lamp, and a thin puppet screen. He starts arranging flat-colored figures made of leather. The light behind them flickers, and the crowd begins to hush. Not silent, but attentive. You know what's coming. Karagöz and Hatsivat. The puppets dance across the screen, arguing like old friends. Karagöz, the trickster, mocks the scholars and pious men. Hatsivat, the educated one, tries in vain to bring reason to chaos. Every joke lands with a quiet ripple of laughter, followed by murmured commentary. This is the Ottoman way. Mock the mighty without naming them. Teach the crowd without preaching. You lean back, the rhythm of the show lulling you. Karagöz complains about taxes. Hachivat replies, "Taxes are like flies. You can't kill one without waking the swarm." The crowd bursts into knowing laughter. You can almost feel the tension evaporate. Laughter, in these walls, is political therapy. When the show ends, applause breaks out in a slow wave. The puppeteer bows and begins packing up his figures, each one carefully wrapped in cloth, as if they're real actors resting between performances. He glances your way and says quietly, "The Sultan banned me once, said laughter was dangerous, but laughter always finds a wall to climb over." The line lingers with you, because in a way, everything in this place, coffee, gossip, games, smoke, is a quiet rebellion against silence. Even pleasure here is resistance. Outside, the call to prayer floats through the window, mingling with the scent of burnt sugar and cardamom. The men pause mid-sentence, not to stop, but to listen, acknowledging the sound like a familiar old song. Then, seamlessly, they resume. The game continues, the cups refill, and the conversation shifts to tomorrow's market prices. You notice how seamlessly the sacred and the ordinary coexist here. There's no rush to separate them. Faith and laughter, prayer and play, devotion and defiance, they all fit together under the same wooden roof. Before leaving, You catch sight of something carved into one of the tables, a tiny inscription in Ottoman Turkish that translates roughly to, "The tongue sleeps for no man." It's scratched so faintly it might disappear in the next polish. But it won't. Nothing truly disappears here. Not the laughter, not the smoke, not even the forbidden thoughts hiding in small talk. You step back into the street, the dawn sharpening around you. Behind the closed shutters, dice roll, pipes bubble, and voices rise in friendly dispute. Somewhere, another storyteller begins his first joke of the day, and as you walk away, you realize these coffee houses don't just serve caffeine, they serve courage wrapped in laughter, disguised as leisure. The night air in Istanbul grows heavier as you wander deeper into the city's maze of alleys. You know exactly where you're heading, a place that looks like any other coffee house from the outside. But if you listen closely, the silence here feels intentional, rehearsed. You push open the door and step into a dim, smoky room where everyone seems to talk just a little too carefully. The walls are thick, the lamps low, and the coffee is strong enough to keep secrets awake. You've just entered one of the Empire's watching rooms, coffee houses where every cup might be poured for a poet, a merchant, or a spy. Nobody advertises it. Everyone knows it. You sit, as always, at the edge, pretending to be tired, tracing patterns in the condensation on your glass. The man behind the counter gives you the briefest nod, acknowledgement without recognition. Across the room, two men argue in whispers about a shipment of grain, but their words don't match their expressions. They're performing a scene, one you've seen before, coded talk for the listener who isn't meant to exist. Historians still argue whether these Ottoman coffee houses truly doubled as spy dens, or whether later writers exaggerated the drama. But either way, the empire's own officials treated them like volcanoes, quiet, unpredictable, capable of erupting without warning. You remember what you've heard before. The Sultan himself had informants in nearly every neighborhood, often disguised as ordinary customers. They'd sit for hours, sipping slowly, pretending to read or play chess, while their ears gathered everything, the gossip, the rumors, the laughter that revealed more than speeches ever could. The government even created a role for this, Kahvehan Nazira, the coffeehouse inspector. Their job? To blend in, to observe, to listen. Sometimes they'd shut down a place. Other times they'd let it thrive just to see what the regulars might reveal. But the twist. The coffeehouse owners knew it, and they played along. That's the real theatre of it all. The cafe becomes a stage, the spies the audience, and everyone acts their part. The storyteller still tells his tales, the poet still recites his verses, the chess players still pretend to care who wins. But every line, every move, every joke carries a second meaning. You hear it tonight. A performer is telling a story about two brothers, one who built walls and one who built bridges. The crowd laughs at the punchlines, but you notice the glances between tables, the careful timing of the words. The brothers are clearly metaphors for the viziers. The story is a critique disguised as entertainment. It's dangerous but brilliant. Halfway through, someone coughs twice near the door, a signal. The storyteller slows his speech, then changes the ending on the spot. Instead of rebellion, the story ends with forgiveness. The crowd relaxes again. The spy gets his safe, boring ending. Everyone wins. It's a delicate game. You realize that coffee houses aren't just places of talk. They're training grounds for subtext. Every Ottoman who spends a few evenings here learns to speak in layers, to mix truth and fiction like sugar and foam. And yet, not all spies are loyal to the Sultan. Some work for foreign merchants, collecting whispers about trade routes, about military plans. Others serve rival factions within the court. One Venetian traveller wrote that the best information about the empire wasn't in palaces. It was served in small cups among strangers. You sip your own and notice a young man beside you taking notes with deliberate neatness. He's using lemon juice as invisible ink. You recognize the faint smell. Later, he'll warm the page over a flame, and the words will reappear. You wonder who he writes for, some pasha maybe, or perhaps a rival storyteller gathering new material. Across the room, a discussion grows heated. A merchant argues that the empire's future depends on reform. His opponent insists the old ways are divine. Their voices rise, sharp as knives, and for a moment everyone freezes. Then the coffeehouse keeper coughs loudly and jokes, "Careful, gentlemen, the walls are better listeners than we are." The tension dissolves into laughter. You realize this is how the empire breathes, through controlled argument. It allows people to test ideas without breaking them, to vent safely, as if the walls themselves are trained to keep secrets. Still, sometimes the secrets slip out. There are stories, half true, half legend, about uprisings planned over cups of coffee, revolts born between spoonfuls of sugar. The Janissaries, it's said, often gathered in coffeehouses before marching. A few imams even claimed that rebellion brews faster than beans. You can picture it, a smoky room like this one, packed shoulder to shoulder, men murmuring plans over clinking cups. Outside, the night wind carries the scent of roasted coffee and anticipation. Inside, a single match could set off a storm. One scholar once wrote that the Ottoman coffeehouse was the empire's nervous system. Too sensitive to silence, too social to suppress. You feel that truth now. Every conversation here ripples outward, touching markets, mosques, courts, and even the palace. No one knows who listens to whom, and that uncertainty becomes its own kind of balance. The night deepens. A lute begins to play softly in the corner, smoothing over the edges of suspicion. Someone brings out a platter of candied almonds. The conversations shift from politics to poetry again, the way rivers meander after a flood. Before you leave, the keeper catches your sleeve. "First time here?" he asks. You nod. He smiles, but his eyes are sharp. "Then remember this. If you don't want your words overheard, speak them louder." Whispering only makes people listen harder. Outside, the wind rattles the wooden shutters. You hear faint laughter from inside, a sound equal parts joy and defiance. Above you, the stars shimmer like sparks scattered from a sesve's fire. And for a moment, you realize the truth. Coffeehouses were never just places to drink. They were the empire's pulse, keeping rhythm between order and chaos, silence and speech. You walk away quietly, your mind buzzing, not from caffeine, but from the knowledge that even a whisper can change an empire. The streets are empty now, but the scent of coffee lingers like a secret perfume. You follow it, letting the aroma guide you to a quiet neighborhood where the morning sun touches the domes and minarets with a soft gold. A small coffeehouse sits in the shade of a walnut tree, its door slightly ajar, beckoning you in. Inside, the usual warmth greets you, the smell of roasted beans, smoldering coals, and a faint hint of rosewater. You take a seat on a low bench. Across from you, a man pours liquid from a tiny brass sesve into a small cup, the surface swirling like dark velvet. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. In this city, coffee is a language all its own. As you sip, your attention drifts to the walls. Faded inscriptions, tiny carvings, and sketches of ships decorate them. One sketch shows a caravan of camels, each carrying sacks labelled coffee, marching toward a distant port. Another depicts a coffeehouse packed with people, their mouths open mid-laugh, their eyes wide with curiosity and defiance. These walls tell stories that words alone could never capture. You notice a small group in the corner, a mix of merchants, scholars, and poets. They're discussing the latest developments from Europe. New telescopes, experimental medicines, and strange philosophical texts. One of them mutters something about Galileo observing moons orbiting Jupiter, and the others lean in, fascinated. "It's almost as if the heavens themselves are rebelling," one says quietly. Laughter ripples through the room. Nearby, a storyteller begins reciting a tale you've heard before, but tonight, it carries a sharper edge. It's about a clever merchant who outwits corrupt officials using nothing but wit and clever timing. The punchlines hit hard, but the room listens carefully. Some chuckle quietly, others nod in understanding. There's an unspoken lesson in every joke. Intelligence and patience can outmaneuver brute power. Someone in the corner hums a melody. The rhythm mimics the bubbling of the sesve on the coals, slow and steady. A young boy, barely old enough to read, sketches small images on a scrap of parchment. Birds, fish, a tiny ship sailing toward the horizon. Each image seems symbolic, a quiet reflection of the dreams carried in this room. The man beside you whispers about the old legends, stories of clandestine meetings, of letters passed secretly, of debates that shaped policy before the palace even heard of them. Coffeehouses, he insists, are where the empire truly flexed its intellectual muscles. A merchant from Galata leans over and shares a fringe tidbit. Some believe that spies from Venice and Cairo regularly meet here, disguised as ordinary patrons, exchanging maps and news over thick cups of coffee. The idea seems absurd, yet entirely plausible. After all, what better cover than the hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of tiny spoons? You glance around. The energy in the room is tangible, a quiet defiance, a careful curiosity, a network of minds meeting over shared warmth. Each laugh, each whisper, each story travels further than the city's walls, carrying ideas that cannot be censored. At a low table near the brazier, a pair of young men plays backgammon. The clatter of the dice punctuates the storyteller's words, a rhythm in counterpoint to the narrative. Each move is deliberate, almost theatrical, with subtle glances exchanged, signals of hidden bets, unspoken commentary, or merely a test of patience and foresight. Games, you realize, are just as much about thought as the coffee itself. Strategy here is as sacred as scripture. A musician in the corner strums an oud, the notes curling through the smoke like ribbons. The melody is slow, thoughtful, and melancholic, adding a dreamlike layer to the room's atmosphere. Patrons pause mid-sentence to listen, and when conversation resumes, it carries the undertone of the music, measured, reflective, interconnected. Near the entrance, a young woman passes unnoticed with a tray of tiny cups, balancing them with deft precision. She's a silent participant in the theatre of the coffee house, a keeper of ritual and flow. One cup is handed to a merchant, another to a student, and each sip seems to synchronize thought across the room. You take your own cup, savoring its strength and aroma, feeling the subtle warmth travel down your throat, awakening your senses and heightening your awareness of every whispered word, every flick of an eye. Stories circulate in whispers, glances, and gestures. Patrons repeat phrases with slight variations, allowing them to travel across tables, walls, and floors like soft, undetectable waves. Some stories are serious, others humorous, a few dangerously subversive. A man at the far end recites a line about the Sultan's taxes, not in mockery, but as allegory, testing the room's collective courage. A ripple of suppressed laughter moves quietly through the crowd, careful, yet knowing. The coffee house is a microcosm of the empire. Commerce, intellect, art, gossip, and politics intertwining seamlessly. Each patron participates in a delicate dance of speech and observation, humor and subtle critique. The space thrives on balance, on the careful negotiation of expression, on the quiet pulse of shared understanding. You watch as the storyteller finishes, bowing slightly while murmuring a line about cleverness and caution. The room applauds softly, the gesture both real and ritualistic. Music resumes, games continue, and the aroma of coffee, mingled with smoke and human energy, fills the space with a sense of continuity, persistence, and quiet revolution. Outside, the call to prayer begins, echoing over the city. Inside, conversation flows uninterrupted, weaving a tapestry of ideas, humor, and resistance. Every cup poured, every word spoken, every glance exchanged is a thread in this intricate web of life, thought, and culture. And as you sip the last of your coffee, you feel the weight of centuries in that warm, bitter liquid, a reminder that these rooms are not merely for drinking, but for shaping minds, building networks, and keeping the heart of the empire alive. Night deepens over Istanbul and the city breathes differently. The call to prayer has faded into memory, leaving a calm hum that wraps around the narrow streets. You enter a coffee house whose lanterns are dimmer than most, their flickering light casting long, wavering shadows across the low wooden tables. The room smells of roasted beans, faint cinnamon, and the lingering sweetness of dried figs. A thin haze of smoke curls upward from the coals, mingling with the scent of wet stone and warm plaster, creating a tangible sense of comfort. Inside, the hum of conversation is softer here, more intentional, deliberate. This is a coffee house where the clever and cautious gather, merchants discussing trade routes with hushed emphasis, poets sharing lines too delicate or daring for louder rooms, students debating philosophy while carefully observing every facial expression. Each cup of coffee seems to enhance attentiveness, the bitter warmth sharpening minds, steadying nerves. You take a seat on a low bench, feeling the slight give of worn cushions beneath you. Across the room, two men play a quiet game of chess. Their moves are slow, each one measured, the tapping of wooden pieces sounding almost like punctuation in the air. One man glances at a nearby map, tracing trade routes with his finger before making his next move. He murmurs something to his opponent about Venice and Mocha, about taxes and tides, and you realize that even recreation here carries lessons for life, strategy, and survival. Historians still argue whether these games were purely leisure or served as discreet training for merchants, diplomats, and civil servants. But watching them, it seems both and more. Near the brazier, a young scholar hunches over parchment, copying verses of an Ottoman poet whose words slice with satire. He writes carefully, pausing to glance at the ceiling, the walls, the other patrons, as though ensuring his work won't draw unwanted attention. Each stroke of ink is deliberate, each word chosen with care. He mutters under his breath, perhaps for emphasis, perhaps as a form of rehearsal. If thoughts are free, words must be cunning. A storyteller clears his throat, and the room's murmur subsides into quiet anticipation. He begins a tale about a merchant who journeys across deserts, evades corrupt officials, and delivers precious goods to distant ports. But the story is more than a narrative. It's a lesson in observation, patience, and adaptability. Listeners laugh at the clever twists, nod at the quiet moral lessons, and exchange subtle glances as though verifying whether they too understand the layers of meaning. Near the doorway, a woman balances a tray of cups with practiced precision. She moves silently, almost a shadow, delivering coffee to scholars, merchants, and students alike. Each cup seems to synchronize thought and energy across the room, an unspoken ritual that binds everyone into the same rhythm. You take a sip and feel a warmth that isn't just physical, it's intellectual, social, and almost spiritual. Historians still debate the coffeehouse's role as an incubator for rebellion, diplomacy, or scholarship. But as you watch, you see all three converge seamlessly. Whispered critiques of taxation sit alongside playful banter. Subtle debates on ethics mingle with laughter, and the exchange of poetry flows alongside discussions of trade. It's a microcosm of empire. Culture, intellect, commerce, and critique all coexisting in a single, vibrant ecosystem. Music begins, faint and deliberate. An oud string vibrates softly, weaving through the conversations, games, and whispered critiques. The rhythm slows and accelerates, shaping the pace of thought without demanding attention. You notice that even the quietest patrons subtly adjust their speech and gestures to the music, participating in a shared, almost unconscious choreography. A young merchant leans toward you and murmurs a fringe tidbit. Some say foreign agents come here disguised, listening to our plans and poetry alike. Coffee hides everything, but it also reveals. You nod, understanding that in this place, every cup poured, every phrase spoken, every glance shared carries multiple meanings, layered and intentional. The storyteller's tale winds to its conclusion, leaving laughter, applause, and quiet reflection in its wake. Patrons exchange notes, finish games, and sip their remaining coffee, their faces lit by lamplight and ideas. You realize that this coffeehouse, like all others in Istanbul, is alive. An organism powered by conversation, imagination, and caffeine. The empire may govern with armies and decrees, but here, in these low-lit rooms, it thrives on subtlety, ingenuity, and the courage to think freely. You stand, your cup empty, but your mind alert. Outside, the city is dark and hushed, the Bosphorus reflecting a ribbon of moonlight. You walk through the alleys, carrying with you the sense of countless whispers, strategies, and stories. The pulse of an empire alive not in swords, but in thought, shared over a cup of coffee. The city has grown quieter now, though the air still vibrates with the faint echoes of the day's conversations. You slip into a coffee house tucked beneath the eaves of a narrow street, where lanterns glow like tiny fireflies against the dark walls. The scent of coffee hits first, bitter and sweet at once, laced with cardamom, a trace of clove, and the faint tang of burnt sugar. Smoke from the brazier curls lazily toward the ceiling, wrapping the room in a warm, hypnotic haze. You take a slow breath and feel the atmosphere wrap around you, heavy with thought, anticipation, and quiet amusement. Inside, the room is alive with layers of activity. Men sit in small clusters, their voices low but urgent, voices that rise and fall in patterns like waves. A student jots notes feverishly, copying a verse, pausing to glance at his neighbors, then resuming. You notice the faint sheen of ink on his fingertips, a mark of dedication or obsession. It's hard to tell which. Historians still argue whether these scribes were chroniclers, spies, or simply lovers of poetry. But here and now, it doesn't matter. Every word written carries weight. In the far corner, a storyteller begins a tale, his voice weaving through the low hum of conversation. Tonight, he spins a story of a merchant navigating both sea and politics. His cunning required as much for surviving the Sultan's scrutiny as for delivering precious goods to distant ports. Laughter punctuates the story, soft but knowing, as listeners absorb subtle critiques of taxation, trade, and hierarchy disguised within humor. You drift closer to a group playing backgammon. The tapping of dice and clattering of pieces creates a rhythm that overlays the storyteller's words. The players are deliberate, almost theatrical, exchanging glances that hint at unspoken strategies. You realize that games here are never mere pastime. They are exercises in patience, foresight, and observation, teaching lessons that extend far beyond the board. A musician in the corner strums a gentle tune on an oud, its notes curling through the smoky air, threading through conversation and laughter. The music is hypnotic, almost guiding the room's tempo. Patrons' movements, gestures, laughter, even the gentle tilt of a cup seem to respond subtly, as if the sound is invisible choreography connecting everyone. You notice a merchant whispering to a scholar about distant trade ports. Maps and diagrams are unfolded discreetly, and yet the conversation is interspersed with jokes about camel caravans and overzealous port officials. Every word seems layered, half commerce, half story, half jest. The coffee house itself feels like a living organism, where each patron contributes to the pulse of ideas, the rhythm of thought, and the safe venting of ambitions. In the middle of it all, a poet recites verses with sharp wit. The lines skirt the edges of authority, critiquing the powerful with allegory, metaphors, and gentle mockery. The crowd responds in quiet applause, knowing glances or stifled laughter, each reaction part of a subtle conversation bridging speaker and listener. The power of words here is tangible. Even silence carries meaning. You sip your coffee slowly, letting the warmth coat your chest, and notice how effortlessly the sacred and the mundane coexist. Traders discuss profit next to verses questioning morality. Musicians play alongside strategists, testing patience and observation. Faith, philosophy, commerce, and art are interwoven into one seamless tapestry, and the room hums with the energy of shared intelligence. Near the entrance, a young woman moves among the tables with a tray of cups, almost a ghost. She delivers coffee with practiced precision, each cup a subtle handshake, a quiet invitation to join the ongoing conversation. Patrons greet her briefly, acknowledging the ritual that binds them together. Each sip of coffee feels like a key unlocking thought, attention, and courage, shaping the way ideas move through the room. Outside, the city is calm under the stars, but inside, life pulses quietly yet insistently. Every cup poured, every whisper exchanged, every story told contributes to a subtle network of intellect, curiosity, and quiet defiance. The coffee house, in all its smoky warmth, is both refuge and arena, where thought is tested, stories are preserved, and the empire's pulse beats steadily, not in proclamations or armies, but in shared words and careful observation. You finish your cup, savoring the last trace of bitterness and warmth. As you rise, the room feels infinite, filled with potential, its energy lingering long after you step into the cool night air. The night has deepened into a soft, almost velvet darkness over Istanbul. The streets quiet but still alive with whispers of the day's events. You step into a final coffee house for the evening, one whose windows glow faintly with amber light, inviting yet understated. The air is thick with the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, cardamom, and a faint trace of sugar burned too long in the sezve. Smoke spirals lazily toward the ceiling, curling and twisting as if performing a slow, meditative dance. You feel the warmth seep into your bones, a gentle reminder that this room, like all Ottoman coffeehouses, exists at the intersection of comfort and alertness. Inside, the space is a microcosm of society. Merchants, scholars, storytellers, and poets occupy every corner, each absorbed in their own dance of words, observation, and strategy. The murmur of conversation rises and falls, like the tide brushing against the edges of the room. You notice the slight tilt of heads, the careful leaning closer during particularly juicy whispers, the subtle exchange of glances that carries more meaning than any spoken sentence. Here, silence is never empty. It's pregnant with anticipation. In one corner, a storyteller sets up a small screen for a shadow play. The flickering light behind the leather figures casts moving silhouettes across the walls. Karagöz and Hativat, the ever-playful puppets, begin their argument. Karagöz mocks the pomp of officials and the pedantry of scholars. Hativat responds with dry, clever retorts. The crowd erupts in soft laughter, the kind that warms the chest and spreads to the fingertips. Through humor and allegory, the puppets reveal truths too daring to voice plainly, and you watch, entranced, as the layers of critique unfold in motion and shadow. Nearby, a group of men plays backgammon, their moves precise and deliberate. Each roll of the dice, each placement of a piece, carries lessons in patience, foresight, and subtle manipulation. You notice that even the smallest gesture, a raised eyebrow, a quiet sigh, carries meaning understood only by those paying close attention. The coffeehouse itself seems to hum in response, its beams and walls vibrating gently with the collective energy of thought and observation. A young poet recites verses, each word carefully selected to balance wit, insight, and mild rebellion. Patrons nod, smile, or chuckle quietly, the interaction subtle but electric. Scholars whisper annotations, merchants note implications for trade and strategy, and students copy the lines meticulously. Every act is participation, every sip of coffee a catalyst for awareness, every glance a subtle exchange of information. Historians still debate whether the Ottoman coffeehouse was a cradle of rebellion, a hub of diplomacy, or merely a social space. But here, it is all three. Simultaneously, the air grows warmer as the brazier continues its steady glow. You notice a woman weaving through the room, carrying trays of tiny cups. Her movements are fluid, unassuming, yet vital. Each cup poured is a signal of inclusion, a gentle handshake, a bridge between minds. The aroma of the coffee seems to amplify the attentiveness of the room, sharpening perception and heightening the senses. You sip slowly, letting the bitter warmth spread, feeling your awareness expand with every swallow. Outside, the city sleeps lightly under a blanket of stars, but inside, life pulses. Conversations continue. Music drifts softly from a lute in the corner. Dice clatter and laughter threads through the smoke. Everything is deliberate, yet spontaneous. A single cup-poured can set the rhythm for a group of patrons. A story's punchline can alter a thought pattern. A glance can communicate caution or encouragement. The coffeehouse is alive, a delicate ecosystem of intellect, creativity, and subtle power. You lean back and watch the final movements of the night. Karagöz's exaggerated gestures, Hachivat's dry rejoinders, a scholar scribbling notes, a merchant quietly calculating routes. The interplay of humor, strategy, observation, and ritual creates a rhythm, a heartbeat that extends beyond the walls. This is the true pulse of the Ottoman world. Not decrees or armies, but minds engaged, challenged, and entertained simultaneously. As you rise to leave, the warmth and energy linger like a soft cloak. Outside, the streets are calm, the lamps flicker in the night breeze, and the distant Bosphorus glints under the moonlight. You carry with you the echoes of laughter, the scent of coffee, the hum of games and debate, and the quiet courage of thousands of whispered ideas. The empire survives not only in its fortresses and palaces, but in these low-lit rooms where words, wit, and coffee keep thought alive. The evening in the Ottoman coffeehouse drifts softly around you, the clink of tiny cups and the faint swirl of coffee steam fading into a gentle hum. You sink into the warmth of the room, the rich aroma wrapping you in a sense of history, ritual, and quiet chatter that never quite becomes noise. Patrons lean in, whispering stories, swapping news from distant streets or bazaars, and yet the underlying rhythm is calm, deliberate, measured. You feel yourself carried along, attuned to the subtle cues, the tilt of a cup, a nod, a pause in conversation that governs centuries of Ottoman social life. Your thoughts trace the smoke curling from tiny pipes, the dark wood tables worn smooth by countless hands, and the gentle tapping of coins exchanged silently. Each gesture, each small sound becomes part of a larger pattern, a delicate choreography of civility, wit, and observation. Even the most ordinary interaction, passing a cup, exchanging a glance, is layered with meaning, teaching you, gently, that attentiveness and patience can make every moment richer, every detail worth noticing. Fringe anecdotes and small oddities, like fortune tellers slipping cryptic notes into cups, float through your mind, mingling with the factual pulse of history, blurring the line between reality and the subtle art of human behavior. You feel the coffeehouse's rhythm settle inside you, a slow, comforting cadence that echoes even after the lamps are dimmed. Let your mind drift along the narrow streets outside, imagining the warm glow spilling onto cobblestones, merchants closing shops, and the muted laughter of those who stayed late. Each sound, each movement, each small ritual becomes softer, more distant, more serene. You are part of this living history now, suspended gently between curiosity, calm, and quiet wonder. Let your breathing follow the gentle tempo of the room, in and out, slow and even. The stories, the whispers, the clinking cups, they will linger only as soft echoes, guiding you into calm, into rest, and into the night's slow embrace.